Loyal dog refuses to leave woman's side, but she finds out why she's shaken. The morning was unusually quiet when Emma stepped out onto her porch, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. The sun was just rising, casting a soft golden glow over the sleepy street. She had planned to spend her Saturday morning reading and tending to her garden, savoring the tranquility of her small suburban home. But as she turned to head back inside, she noticed something unusual at the edge of her driveway, a dog sitting perfectly still, its eyes fixed on her. Emma frowned, setting her coffee down on the porch railing. The dog was a large shepherd mix, its coat a mix of black and tan, its ears alert and its posture calm but watchful. She glanced around, expecting to see someone walking nearby, but the street was empty. "Where did you come from?" she murmured, stepping down the porch steps cautiously. The dog didn't move. It simply stared at her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Emma hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. The dog didn't appear aggressive, but its unwavering focus was unsettling. "Are you lost?" she asked softly, inching closer. The dog tilted its head slightly, as if it understood her words. Emma crouched down, keeping a safe distance. "You don't have a collar. No tags either." "Poor thing." The dog stood suddenly, its body tense but not threatening. Emma froze, watching as it took a few steps closer to her. Its tail wagged slowly, tentatively, as though it were waiting for her approval. "Okay," Emma said, her voice steady. "You're friendly, aren't you?" She reached out a hand, palm up, letting the dog approach on its own terms. It sniffed her hand briefly before sitting down again, this time closer to her. Emma let out a small breath of relief. "You must belong to someone nearby," she said. "Maybe you wandered too far from home." She stood and walked back toward her porch, expecting the dog to stay put. But when she glanced over her shoulder, it was following her. "Oh no," she said, half laughing. "I'm not your owner." The dog stopped at the base of the porch steps, its eyes locked on hers. There was something almost pleading in its gaze, a silent request that Emma couldn't ignore. "Fine," she said with a sigh. "You can stay for a little while, but I'm going to find out where you belong." She grabbed a bowl from the kitchen and filled it with water, setting it down on the porch. The dog lapped it up gratefully, its tail wagging a little faster now. Emma couldn't help but smile. "You're a sweet one, aren't you?" As the day went on, the dog stayed by Emma's side. It followed her to the garden, lying down in the shade as she weeded and pruned her plants. It stayed close as she went inside to grab a snack, sitting patiently by the door until she returned. Emma found herself talking to it, sharing small details about her day, as though it were an old friend. "You remind me of Max," she said at one point, her voice soft. Max had been her childhood dog, a loyal golden retriever who had passed away years ago. The thought brought a bittersweet smile to her face. "I wonder what your name is." By evening, Emma still hadn't seen anyone looking for a lost dog. She posted a picture of it on the neighborhood app, hoping someone would recognize it. But as the sun set, no responses came. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," she said as the dog followed her back into the house. It settled near the couch, its head resting on its paws, as though it had lived there forever. That night, Emma lay in bed, her mind racing with questions. Who did the dog belong to? Why had it chosen her house, her porch, her side? And why did it feel like there was more to its presence than simple chance? Just as she was drifting off to sleep, a sound jolted her awake, a low growl coming from the living room. Emma sat up, her heart pounding. She grabbed her phone and crept toward the door, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The growl came again, sharper this time. Emma peeked around the corner and saw the dog standing in front of the window, its body rigid, its ears pinned back. Its gaze was fixed on something outside. "What is it?" she whispered, flipping on the light. The dog didn't turn toward her. It remained focused, its growl deepening. Emma approached cautiously, pulse racing. She glanced out the window, but saw nothing unusual, just the quiet street, lit dimly by the glow of the streetlights. "You're spooking me, buddy," she said, placing a hand on the dog's back. Its fur was bristling under her touch, and it let out a low bark, as though trying to warn her. Emma checked the locks on the doors and windows, her unease growing. She couldn't shake the feeling that the dog knew something she didn't. Finally, she returned to her room, leaving the light on in the living room. The dog followed, lying at the foot of her bed this time, its head resting on its paws but its ears still alert. "Who are you?" Emma murmured as sleep finally claimed her. The next morning, Emma woke to find the dog sitting by the front door, its gaze fixed on the handle. It looked at her as she approached, letting out a soft whine. "You want to go outside?" she asked. The dog wagged its tail slightly, standing as she opened the door. Emma expected it to wander off, but instead, it stepped onto the porch and sat down, facing the street. It seemed to be waiting for something or someone. "Are you guarding me?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. The dog didn't respond, but its posture remained vigilant. Emma decided to follow its lead, grabbing her coat and stepping onto the porch beside it. The air was crisp, the morning quiet except for the occasional chirp of a bird. But then, in the distance, Emma saw something or someone. A figure was moving down the street, slow and deliberate. The dog tensed beside her, its body low to the ground, a low growl rumbling in its throat. "Who is that?" Emma whispered, her pulse quickening. The figure stopped in front of her driveway, their face obscured by a hood. The dog's growl deepened, its body coiled like a spring. Emma stepped back, her heart pounding. "Is this why you're here?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. The figure stood motionless at the end of the driveway, their posture eerily calm despite the dog's growling. Emma's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. The dog, usually so calm and composed, was now bristling with tension, its growl growing louder, more insistent. Emma swallowed hard, summoning her courage. "Can I help you?" she called, her voice shaky but firm. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they tilted their heads slightly, as if assessing her. Finally, they took a single step forward, their boots crunching against the gravel. The motion set the dog off. It barked sharply, stepping in front of Emma, its body a protective shield. "Easy, buddy," Emma whispered, placing a hand on the dog's back. Its fur was standing on end, its focus unwavering. The figure stopped again, their hand rising slowly. "I don't mean any harm," a voice called, muffled by the hood. It was a man, his tone calm but with an edge of weariness. "I just came to get what's mine." Emma stiffened. "What do you mean?" she asked, her fear giving way to confusion. The man took another step forward, lowering his hood to reveal a face lined with exhaustion. His eyes were dark, heavy with something Emma couldn't quite place. Guilt, perhaps, or grief. "That dog," he said, nodding toward the shepherd. "He's mine." Emma's grip tightened on the dog's fur. "If he's your dog, why is he here? Why did he come to me?" The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated," he said, "but he shouldn't be here. He's been trained to stay with me." The word struck Emma as odd, almost clinical. "Trained," she repeated, her mind racing. "What do you mean, trained?" The man hesitated, glancing at the dog. "I'm handler," he said carefully. "This dog, his name's Shadow. He's part of a program. He's not a pet." Emma blinked, her confusion deepening. "A program? What kind of program?" The man hesitated again, then sighed. "Military," he admitted. "Shadow was trained to work with me. He's a search and rescue dog." The revelation left Emma momentarily speechless. She looked down at the dog, Shadow, and saw him in a new light. His discipline, his unwavering focus, the way he had seemed to be protecting her, it all made sense now. "But if he's your dog," she said slowly, "why did he leave you? Why did he come here?" The man's expression darkened, his shoulders slumping slightly. "We were deployed together," he said, his voice quieter now. "I got hurt bad. They sent me home, but..." Shadow didn't adjust well to civilian life. He got spooked one day and bolted. Emma's heart ached at the story, but something still didn't add up. "Why did he come to me?" she asked. "Why my house?" The man's gaze shifted to the ground, his jaw tightening. I think he's trying to tell you something." "What could he possibly need to tell me?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. The man looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't know," he admitted. "But he's not just any dog. He's trained to find people, to stay with them until help comes. If he came here to you, there's a reason." Emma felt the weight of his words settle over her. She looked down at Shadow, who was still standing protectively in front of her, his eyes locked on the man. There was no aggression in his stance now, only a quiet determination. "Okay," Emma said finally, her voice steady. "Let's figure out why he's here." The man nodded, his expression softening. "Do you mind if I come closer? He might respond better if I'm near." Emma hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Fine. But if he doesn't like it, you back off." The The man approached slowly, his hands visible, his movements careful. Shadow watched him closely, his ears twitching, but he didn't growl or back away. When the man was just a few feet away, he crouched down, his voice soft. "Shadow," he said. "It's me, buddy." Shadow's body relaxed slightly, but he didn't leave Emma's side. The man frowned, his brow furrowing. "He's still protecting you," he said, glancing up at her. "He thinks you need help." Emma shook her head. "I don't." She stopped mid-sentence, the realization hitting her like a thunderbolt. The way Shadow had growled at the window the night before, his vigilance, his refusal to leave her side, it wasn't random. He wasn't just protecting her from the man. He was protecting her from something else. Emma's stomach twisted as a memory surfaced, something she'd brushed off as paranoia earlier that week. The feeling of being watched, the unfamiliar car parked across the street for hours, the faint sound of footsteps near her backyard at night. She had dismissed it all as coincidence, but now, "Someone's been watching me," she said aloud, her voice shaking. The man's expression turned serious. "What do you mean?" Emma explained, her words tumbling out in a rush. The man listened intently, his face growing darker with every detail. "If Shadow's been staying with you," he said slowly, "it's because he senses something. He wouldn't stay unless he thought you were in danger." Emma's chest tightened. "Danger from what?" The man stood, his posture tense. "I don't know. But if Shadow's protecting you, we need to figure it out." Shadow barked sharply, drawing their attention to the street. A car had pulled up, idling at the curb. Emma's heart skipped a beat as the driver stepped out. A man in dark clothing, his face obscured by a baseball cap. "Is that him?" the handler asked urgently. I don't know," Emma stammered. The stranger lingered by the car, his head turning toward them. Shadow growled low, his body coiled like a spring. "Get inside," the handler said firmly. "No." Emma didn't argue. She grabbed Shadow's collar and hurried toward the door, heart pounding as the stranger took a step closer. Emma's hands trembled as she shut the door behind her, locking it quickly. Shadow was at her side, his growl rumbling like distant thunder. The handler stood by the window, peeking through the curtain at the man outside. "He's not moving yet," the handler muttered. "But he's watching the house." Emma's chest tightened as fear surged through her. What does he want? Why is he here? The handler turned to her, his face grim. "I don't know, but Shadow's instincts are rarely wrong. He thinks you're in danger, and he's usually right." Shadow barked sharply, his body tense as he moved toward the front door. Emma flinched at the sound, her heart racing. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking. The handler looked at her, his expression steady despite the tension in the room. "Stay calm," he said. "We don't know his intentions yet. I'll handle it." Emma nodded, though her fear didn't subside. She crouched next to Shadow, stroking his fur for her own comfort as much as his. "You're protecting me, aren't you?" she whispered. Shadow's green eyes flicked to hers briefly before returning to the door, his focus unbroken. The handler opened the door a crack, stepping out onto the porch. The stranger was still by the car, his posture casual, but his presence unnerving. "Hey," the handler called, his voice firm. "What do you want?" The stranger turned slowly, his face partially obscured by the cap. "Just looking for someone," he said, his voice calm but with an edge that sent a chill down Emma's spine. "You've been parked here for a while," the handler said, stepping closer. "Who exactly are you looking for?" The man smirked, his eyes narrowing. "None of your business." Shadow barked loudly from inside, the sound sharp and commanding. The stranger's gaze flicked to the door, his smirk faltering for a moment before returning. "Nice dog," he said. "Looks like he's trained." The handler's jaw tightened. "If you've got no business here, you should leave." The man held up his hands in mock surrender. All right, he said, taking a step back toward his car. Didn't mean to cause any trouble." But as he reached for the car door, his smirk returned. "You should keep an eye on your place," he added. "You never know who might be watching." The handler didn't respond, his eyes locked on the man as he got into the car and drove off. Only when the taillights disappeared down the street did he exhale, his posture relaxing slightly. Emma opened the door, her heart pounding. "What did he mean by that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who was he?" The handler shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. But Shadow wasn't wrong. That guy was trouble. Emma leaned against the doorframe, trying to steady her breathing. "What do I do now? I can't live like this." wondering if someone's watching me, waiting for something to happen. The handler placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. First, we report this to the police. They need to know what's going on. And second, he glanced at Shadow, who had settled at Emma's feet, his body still tense but calmer now. You trust Shadow. He's not just here by accident. He's here for a reason. Emma looked down at the dog, her fear mingling with gratitude. He chose me, she said softly. The handler nodded. And he won't leave your side until he knows you're safe. Over the next few days, the police increased patrols in the neighborhood, and the handler helped Emma install a security system. Shadow never let his guard down, patrolling the house like a sentinel, his loyalty unwavering. His presence brought Emma a sense of safety she hadn't realized she needed, his quiet strength a constant reassurance. One evening, as Emma sat on the couch with Shadow resting his head on her lap, she realized how much her life had changed in such a short time. This dog, a stranger only days ago, had become her protector, her companion, her lifeline. You saved me, she whispered, stroking his fur. Shadow looked up at her, his green eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name: trust, understanding, and a fierce, unyielding loyalty. And in that moment, Emma knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. Shadow would be there, standing guard, a silent protector who had found his purpose by her side. The following weeks passed in a haze of cautious normalcy. The police followed up on Emma's report, though they could provide little more than assurances that they'd keep an eye on the situation. The handler visited frequently, checking in on both Shadow and Emma, offering his expertise in subtle ways. He shared tips on reading Shadow's behavior, ensuring Emma understood the signals her loyal guardian might give. Despite these measures, Emma couldn't entirely shake the feeling that danger still lingered, hidden just beyond the edges of her quiet life. But Shadow's presence made all the difference. His sharp instincts, unwavering vigilance, and quiet companionship became a source of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Then, one night, the unease returned. Emma had just settled into bed, her book open on her lap and Shadow lying on the rug by the door. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the heater. She was starting to drift off when Shadow's head snapped up, his ears twitching. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Emma froze. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Shadow stood, his body tense, his gaze fixed on the window. Emma's stomach twisted as she followed his line of sight. The street outside was dark, the streetlights casting faint pools of light on the pavement. But there, just barely visible, was a shadow moving along the edge of her property. Her pulse quickened as she reached for her phone. Shadow moved to the door, his growl deepening. The shadow outside lingered, its movement slow and deliberate, as though it wanted to be seen. Emma dialed the police with trembling fingers, her voice barely steady as she explained the situation. "Someone's outside my house," she said, keeping her eyes on the figure. "They're just standing there. We're sending a unit," the dispatcher assured her. "Stay inside and keep your doors locked." Emma hung up, clutching the phone tightly. Shadow barked sharply, his body pressed against the door like a barricade. The figure outside took a step closer, stepping into the dim light. It was the man from before, the stranger who had confronted the handler and her on the porch. Emma's breath caught. Her fingers hovered over her phone, ready to call the handler, but before she could, the man did something that made her blood run cold. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile, and raised his hand to tap on the window. Shadow's bark exploded, loud and commanding. The sound seemed to shake the house, and the man backed away slightly, his expression hardening. He mouthed something Emma couldn't hear, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Emma sat on the floor beside Shadow, her hand on his fur as they waited for the police to arrive. When they finally did, they found no sign of the man. The officers searched the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but the stranger had vanished. "We'll increase patrols in the area," one officer assured her. "Let us know if he comes back." Emma nodded, though the words did little to comfort her. After the officers left, she locked every door and window, double-checking each one before retreating to her room with Shadow at her side. As she lay in bed, sleep felt impossible. The image of the man's smile haunted her, his silent message chilling her to the core. But as she glanced at Shadow, lying alert by the door, she felt a flicker of courage. He had protected her before, and she knew he would again. The next morning, Emma called the handler and told him everything. His reaction was immediate. "I'm coming over," he said. Don't go outside. Don't let anyone in but me." When he arrived, Shadow greeted him with a wag of his tail, but his body remained tense, his gaze sharp. The handler crouched to examine Shadow, running his hands over the dog's sturdy frame. "He's on edge," he said, his tone grim. "He knows something's coming. What do I do?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. "I can't live like this, waiting for something to happen." The handler looked at her, his expression serious. "We need to prepare. Shadow's instincts are telling us the threat isn't gone. If this guy comes back, we have to be ready." For the next few days, the handler worked with Emma and Shadow, teaching her how to read the dog's cues and respond quickly in an emergency. Shadow seemed to thrive under the training, his sharp mind and disciplined nature shining through. Emma, too, found herself growing more confident, her fear tempered by the knowledge that she wasn't alone. Then, on the fourth night, the man returned. It was just past midnight when Shadow's growl woke Emma. She sat up, her heart racing as she saw him standing by the window, his posture rigid. She grabbed her phone and called the handler, her voice urgent. "He's back." "I'm on my way," the handler said. "Lock the doors and stay with Shadow." Emma hung up and moved to the living room, Shadow at her side. The man stood in the driveway, his silhouette illuminated by the streetlights. This time, he didn't linger in the shadows. He approached the house, his movements slow and deliberate. Shadow barked, a sharp warning sound that seemed to shake the walls. The man stopped, his expression unreadable. He raised his hands as though surrendering, but there was something unsettling in the way he moved. "Leave," Emma shouted through the window. "The police are on their way." The man didn't respond. Instead, he took another step closer. Shadow barked again, louder this time, and Emma felt a surge of fear and determination. She wasn't going to let this man win, not with Shadow by her side. The man's slow approach toward the house sent adrenaline coursing through Emma's veins. Shadow was a wall of unyielding protection at her side, barking with such force that the sound reverberated through the small house. The stranger stopped just short of the porch, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. He tilted his head, his movements calm and calculated, as though he had all the time in the world. "Stay where you are," Emma yelled through the window, clutching her phone in one hand. "I've called the police. They're on their way." The man's expression didn't change. He reached into his jacket, and for a moment, Emma's breath caught in her throat. Was he armed? She instinctively stepped back, her free hand gripping the edge of the couch. Shadow barked again, his body tense, ready to spring at the first sign of danger. Instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a small object and held it up to the porch light. Emma squinted, trying to make it out. Key tarnished and weathered with age. He spoke for the first time, his voice low and cold. "This belongs to me," he said. "And so does that dog." Shadow growled louder, his teeth bared as he stepped forward. Emma felt her courage strengthen at the sight of him. "You're not coming in here," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I don't care what you think belongs to you. Leave now." The man didn't move. "You don't understand," he said, his tone eerily calm. "I trained that dog. He knows me. He was supposed to stay with me." Emma's heart twisted as the pieces began to fall into place. "You abandoned him," she said, her voice rising with anger. "He found me. He's protecting me now because you didn't." The man's calm exterior cracked, his face twisting into a scowl. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "Shadow was mine. I had my reasons for letting him go." "Reasons?" Emma shot back. "You mean excuses? You let him fend for himself, and now you want him back." Before the man could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel cut through the tension. Emma glanced toward the driveway and saw the handler's truck pull in, its headlights illuminating the scene. Relief surged through her as he stepped out, his movements purposeful and steady. The man on the porch turned, his expression hardening. "This isn't your business," he said, his voice laced with warning. The handler ignored him, his focus shifting to Emma and Shadow. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Emma nodded, her breath still coming in short bursts. "He won't leave," she said. "He keeps saying Shadow belongs to him." The handler's jaw tightened as he turned back to the man. "You need to leave," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This dog has a new life now. He's not yours anymore." The man's fists clenched at his sides. "You don't get it," he said, his voice rising. "That dog and I, we've been through things you wouldn't understand. He's mine. Shadow let out a sharp bark, his gaze locked on the man. The handler took a step forward, his body a shield between Emma and the stranger. You're not taking him, he said, his voice low and steady. You abandoned him. He made his choice, and he's protecting her now. For a moment, the man seemed to falter, his defiance flickering. But then he straightened, his expression hardening once more. This isn't over, he said, his voice a thinly veiled threat. He turned and walked back to his car, his movements stiff with anger. The vehicle roared to life and sped away, its taillights disappearing into the night. Emma sank onto the couch, her body trembling as the tension drained from her. Shadow nuzzled her hand, his green eyes soft with concern. She stroked his fur, her voice barely a whisper. You're amazing, she said. You knew. You always knew. The handler sat across from her, his expression serious. You did good, he said. But I don't think this guy is done. He might come back. Emma nodded, her determination hardening. Then we'll be ready. In the days that followed, Emma worked with the handler and the police to secure her home and ensure Shadow's safety. The stranger did return, but Emma knew the battle wasn't over. Shadow remained her steadfast protector, his loyalty and courage unwavering. One evening, as she sat by the fire with Shadow curled at her feet, Emma reflected on everything they had been through. This dog, her unexpected guardian, had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. He had taught her the true meaning of trust, strength, and resilience. You saved me, she whispered, leaning down to press her forehead against Shadow's. His tail thumped softly against the floor, his eyes closing in contentment. And in that quiet moment, Emma knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Shadow had chosen her, and she had chosen him. Together, they were stronger than any threat that might come their way. A cold wind howled through the darkened neighborhood that night, rattling windows and sweeping fallen leaves across the empty streets. Emma had just locked the doors and was heading to bed when Shadow's growl rumbled low from the living room. She froze mid-step, her heart pounding. Shadow only growled when something or someone was wrong. Shadow, she called softly, her voice trembling. The dog was already at the front door, his body stiff and his gaze fixed on the darkness outside. His growl deepened, a warning that sent a chill racing down Emma's spine. She moved to the window and peeked through the blinds, her stomach twisting when she saw a car idling at the curb. Its headlights were off, the vehicle almost invisible in the shadowy street. Emma's phone felt heavy in her hand as she dialed the handler. He picked up on the second ring. Emma? What's wrong? He's back, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. That man. He's sitting outside my house. The handler's tone sharpened. Don't engage. Lock everything and stay away from the windows. I'm on my way. As Emma hung up, Shadow barked sharply, his body pressing against the door. The sound was almost deafening in the quiet house, a clear signal of his readiness to defend. Emma grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously to the kitchen, checking the back door and windows to ensure they were secure. Her hands shook as she bolted the locks, her mind racing with possibilities. The sound of a car door slamming made her spin around. She raced back to the living room just as the man stepped into view. He was walking up her driveway, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Shadow barked again, his growl punctuating the tense air. Emma pressed her back against the wall, her pulse racing. She picked up the phone to call the police, but before she could dial, the man's voice carried through the door. Emma, he called, his tone oddly calm. We need to talk. She didn't respond. Instead, she crouched beside Shadow, her hand resting on his fur as she whispered, It's okay, boy. We've got this. The man knocked lightly, a sound that seemed almost mocking in the tense silence. I just want to see him, he said, his voice smooth. You can't keep him forever. He belongs with me. Shadow let out another fierce bark, his body a coiled spring, ready to act. Emma's fear gave way to anger. Get off my property, she shouted, her voice stronger than she expected. The police are on their way. There was a pause, and then the man laughed, a low, unsettling sound. The police, he said. They won't do anything. This isn't their fight. A loud bang made Emma jump. The man had slammed his fist against the door, his calm facade cracking. Open up, Emma, he shouted, his voice sharp with frustration. You don't understand what that dog means to me. Leave. Emma yelled back, gripping her phone tightly. But instead of retreating, the man jiggled the doorknob, testing its lock. Shadow barked furiously, his teeth bared as he pressed against the door. Emma scrambled to dial 911, her voice shaking as she reported the intruder. "He's trying to get in," she said, her breath coming in short bursts. "Please hurry." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way, but Emma's fear didn't ease. The man wasn't backing down. She could hear him muttering angrily, his voice muffled through the door. Then, everything went quiet. Emma held her breath, her ears straining for any sound. Shadow's growl subsided, but his posture remained tense, his eyes fixed on the door. Emma risked a glance through the blinds, her stomach churning when she saw that the man was gone. "Where did he go?" she whispered. A sudden crash from the backyard answered her question. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat as she heard glass shattering. Shadow bolted toward the noise, barking with a ferocity that sent adrenaline surging through Emma. She grabbed a kitchen knife and followed, her hands trembling as she moved toward the back of the house. The patio door had been smashed, the cold night air flooding the room. Shadow stood in front of the broken glass, his growls sharp and unrelenting. "Stay back," Emma shouted, gripping the knife tightly. The man stepped through the shattered doorway, his eyes wild and his movements erratic. "I didn't want to do this," he said, his voice unsteady. "But you left me no choice." Shadow lunged, his bark echoing through the house as he placed himself between Emma and the man. The intruder stopped short, his face pale as Shadow's snarling filled the air. "Call him off," the man demanded, his voice tinged with fear. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." "Then leave," Emma shouted, her anger overriding her fear. "You've already done enough." The man took a step back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. But Shadow didn't relent, his growls growing louder as he edged closer to the intruder. The sound of approaching sirens broke through the tension, their wailing pitch growing louder with each passing second. The man's face twisted with frustration. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. He turned and bolted, disappearing into the night just as the red and blue lights of police cars illuminated the street. Emma collapsed onto the floor, her chest heaving as relief and exhaustion washed over her. Shadow nudged her gently, his green eyes soft with concern. She wrapped her arms around him, her tears spilling onto his fur. "You saved me again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're incredible." As the police entered the house, their questions came fast and urgent. Emma answered as best she could, her hands still shaking. But through it all, Shadow remained by her side, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. When the handler arrived minutes later, he took one look at the scene and knelt beside Emma and Shadow. "He won't come back," he said firmly. "Not after this." Emma nodded, her grip on Shadow tightening. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. With Shadow by her side, she would face it with courage and strength. In the days that followed the intruder's final attempt, Emma's life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The police had taken her report seriously this time, and the handler worked tirelessly to ensure her home was secure. They installed reinforced locks, cameras, and motion detectors, all while ensuring that Shadow's protective instincts remained sharp. Shadow had become more than a protector, he was a partner. His quiet presence in the house felt like a tangible shield, his loyalty and courage a source of comfort. Whenever Emma began to feel overwhelmed by the lingering memories of that terrifying night, Shadow was there, his calm gaze grounding her. The handler stopped by one afternoon, his expression lighter than usual. "We've got good news," he said, setting a stack of papers on the counter. "The guy? He's been caught." Emma's heart leapt. "Are you serious?" The handler nodded. "He tried to break into another house 2 towns over. The police caught him in the act, and now he's in custody. You won't have to worry about him anymore." Relief washed over Emma like a wave, her shoulders sagging as the tension she'd been carrying for weeks finally began to dissipate. She looked down at Shadow, who was lying by her feet, his head resting on his paws. "Hear that, buddy?" she said, her voice soft. "We're safe now." Shadow thumped his tail once, his eyes warm with understanding. Emma crouched down and scratched behind his ears, her gratitude overwhelming. "You're amazing," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The handler smiled. "You're both amazing. He's not just protecting you. You've given him a purpose again. Dogs like Shadow need that." Emma nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. She thought about everything Shadow had done for her, standing guard, warning her of danger, facing down threats with unwavering bravery. But more than that, he had given her something she hadn't realized she was missing, a sense of connection, of trust, of unconditional love. That evening, Emma sat on the porch with Shadow at her side, the fading light casting a golden glow over the quiet street. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming flowers and fresh grass. It was the first time in weeks that she truly felt at peace. "You've changed everything, you know that," she said, her hand resting on Shadow's head. "I thought I was rescuing you, but you're the one who saved me." Shadow nudged her hand with his nose, his tail wagging softly. Emma laughed, the sound light and free. She couldn't remember the last time she felt this happy, this whole. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Emma looked down at the dog who had become her guardian, her companion, her friend. "We're a team now," she said, her voice steady. "And no matter what comes next, we'll face it together." Shadow let out a quiet huff of agreement, his green eyes glinting in the starlight. Emma smiled, her heart full. For the first time in a long time, the world felt safe, her path forward clear. And as they sat together, the night stretching peacefully around them, Emma knew that Shadow's loyalty would never waver. He was hers, and she was his, bound not by circumstance, but by the unbreakable bond they had forged.